no shanu. I'll shever basami. Badarti shama. Efasi pasni. Hatzari and the Gilad. Imrope in sham. Madua also. Arukas pasami. Niten Roshmayim. Veni Mikardima. Veke Yomam Volaila. Eis Kaule Basami. Yitnei Bamidbar. Malone Arshim. Vezva Asami. Velva Meitam. Kikulam Nafim. Atzeres Vokim. Vayad Ripu Es Lashonam. Kashtam Sheker. Lo emna apruva haaretz ki meira elra yatsau vosilo yadau no Adonai ishmerehu ishameru yalkala al tirtachu
Recording in progress.
Asher Kazeh, Lonis Sisnake Nafshi, Alarim, Esa, Yudivanehi, Ganos Midbar Kinitsu Miblish over. Lo shamu kommitne meo hashamayim biadema nadu halahu nasati yeshu sholayim legalim montanim vesarei Yehuda eten shmama miblioshe mioshe miyovein esoshe Vasher diver the Adonai Elav the Avida Allah of the Haaretz Nitzach Hamidbar Mishbiover Vayomer Adonai Aladvam Vestorasi Asher Nasat Mehem Lo Shemu B'Kolim Lo Chavuva Vayochu Acharei Shviros Libam Acharei Havialim Asher Limdum Avosam V'chei Tomar Adonai Tzvos Israel Hineni Makila Masamasel Lana Ishkisim Meirosh V'Apitzosim Bakayim Asher Lo Yadu Ein Mavavosam V'Shilachti Achreihem Esacherev Hakalotzili Yosam Go on power and I was disponing to the Kirufam Lam Konin knows Oena Mos Shilku Visarona Usmahen she's not this clean. Sana Olenei say Radna a Nenu Gima Papa Penu Yisumarim keep on the Nishma Nitzion Judadu Totally of Yosab Nuares Ishli Rushino Sandu Ishaman Nashim Adonai Visika Asnafan Varpi Lamedna Nosechem Nehi Isha Rusa Kinot. Maves b'chalonenu, v'barnosenu, v'achris olam nichus, v'achurim nerchavos, daber. Kol, Yom Adonai, nafla neflas adam, kidomen, avnei hasodeh, u'chamir, me'atrei ha'kotzer, v'yenyaseh, Omar Adonai, Ayisalel, Chacham, Chachmasau, Ayisalel, Hadivar, Rasau, Ayisalel, Ashir, Yashro, Inzos, Salel, Hamisalel, Askel, Yosi, Ki Ani Adonai, Oseh, Esel, Mishpat, Mishpaka, Vahares, Kivelo, Fafasti, Num Adonai, So applications are,
Please be seated. Okay, just as we're getting underway, if someone who's online, just give me a thumbs up or write something in the chat so I know that it's actually getting through without too much feedback. This year, we're going out of order. By rights, the first Kina that we should read is Kina number 6, Vav, Shabbat Suru. We should start with that. It was written by the Kalir of Elazar HaKalir. And Elazar Kalir, we're not exactly sure when he lived. Some say he lived in the early Middle Ages. Some say he was a Tana. That's a gap of hundreds and hundreds of years. But there's a certain way that sometimes suffering causes time to collapse and to be distorted. We can't remember the sequence of things, or at least how long had passed since a certain time, or maybe it's longer, shorter, it's hard to know. We should start there because the early Kinot are all written by the Kalir, and they're about the Beit HaMikdash, and they're about Yerushalayim, and we'll come to some of those themes. Instead, we're going to start today with a Kina that's not in the Kinot book, but is on the packet that I gave out. And if you're online, you can find it in the email that I sent out yesterday. It should still be there. The packet with the various Kinot in it that we'll get to some of today here, and some of you'll have to just try to get to at home. This Kinot was written by Zev Shandalov, Rabbi Zev Shandalov, who was, of course, a member of our broader community for many years as a Rav in the city. And he now lives in Eretz Yisrael. I didn't get this from him. It's been going around. People are sending them around. So he wrote this. You can see it's pretty brief, but he's following in line with what's meant to happen when Kinot are written, which is the usage of psukim in order to try to make sense of events that have transpired and trying to conjure sense of the grief through the psukim that already exist within our liturgy and within our Tanakh, our Midrashim. And that's what you see here in front of you. We bring language. Again, it says page 3 on the bottom of the sheet. It's the back of in the packet, it's the back of the sheet. I've just posted the link to the PDF. If you're online, you can see it there. You click on it. It's page 3. Yeah, it starts Kinot la Korban on the top. And as is often the case, you see it's even footnoted to tell you what psukim they're from, etc. The tradition of the Kinot is to bring language, poetic language, to grief, to memorialize it. And that's very much what we're trying to do on this day. Rabbi Shandalov opens with the shock of everything, the shock of it. And that fits very nicely in a sad way, but with the theme of the next Kinot, the Kinot that we'll read after that, number 6, that starts with the word shavat, which means a cessation, a stop, a cease, an eerie quiet that follows a bewildering shock. And you could say, well, okay, that's 10-7, a terrible, terrible thing. But Tisha B'Av is actually much bigger than that. It's much bigger than that because Tisha B'Av is really all the way back to the first calamities, destruction of the Batei Mikdash and Yerushalayim, etc. And on one level, you're right. You're right. But you might remember we had a visit from Golan Vach in our shul. He came in February, and Golan Vach spent a lot of time inside Gaza. Prior to that, his expertise was to be in charge of search and rescue for Medinat Yisrael. And that means that he traveled the world to rescue people from collapsed buildings and from earthquakes with collapsed buildings. He got to Florida when that terrible tragedy happened in Surfside. And when he gave his presentation here, he reminded us about why October 7th is all about Yerushalayim, in case we didn't already realize. First of all, obviously, the enemy referred to it as the Al-Aqsa flood, and Al-Aqsa refers to the Har HaBayit. We should be mindful of that. That's what they have in mind. But he showed us a picture from several years ago when he was called in to the attack tunnels dug by the Hezbollah, Yemach Shema v'Zichram. And when he was in the tunnel, he saw the inscription at the top of the tunnel, main tunnel that they found, was an inscription this way to Yerushalayim. They write it in their language, Al-Quds, with an arrow, and he put it up on the screen for us in our shul. He actually held it, put it up on the projector screen for us to see the inscription. Those of us who were on the mission, we had actually heard that presentation. He showed us that already when we were in Eretz Yisrael. And Nafal Simon, for whoever didn't have it yet, like the penny dropped. He realized, this is all about Yerushalayim. I'll remind you just now, Shabbat, I talked about the fact that, as I mentioned it before, but it's germane to today, the fact that a number of Chayalim who were in Khan Yunis said that house to house, pretty much every house that you go to, in the living room, is a picture of Yerushalayim, of the Temple Mount. And I mentioned to you that Doron Peretz, Rav Doron Peretz, his wife Shelley is on a campaign she picked up from a family in Eli that they're dedicating in memory of their son, Daniel Shemikum Damo, that every home should have, it's a block of wood and has a sticker that goes on it. That's a picture of the Beit HaMikdash, an artist's rendering, obviously, and a line from the Gemara about the notion that the Geula will come, kima kima, step by step, the Geula will come, and every Jewish home should have such a thing. For those who don't already have the Meshkachech in their home, etc. Years ago, before temple denial became fashionable, when I lived when Lori and I and our family lived in Connecticut, one of our Balabatim is a professor who had in his possession a guide that was frayed. He gave it to me one year. He didn't let me keep the original, but I made copies. It's dated 1930, Jerusalem, a brief guide to the Al-Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem, published by the Supreme Muslim Council. This is in the wake of Tarpat, of the massacre that transpired in 1929 of Jews in Hebron, which itself was a result of claims, libelous claims made against Jews that had to do, again, with Yerushalayim and the Har Bayit. Anyway, when you're on the first page, the Haram, the historical sketch, in this one in 1930, they let you know that this site is one of the oldest in the world. Its sanctity dates from the earliest, perhaps from prehistoric times. Its identity with the site of Solomon's temple is beyond dispute. This too is the spot, according to the universal belief, on which David built there an altar unto the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. But for the purposes of this guide, which confines itself to the Muslim period, the starting point is the year 637. In that year, the Caliph Omar occupied Jerusalem, and one of his first acts described here by them is to repair the site, which had already become sacred in the eyes of Muslims, etc., etc. And it gives you the history of the building of the Dome of the Rock, which transpired a period of time later. So at least in 1930, they were willing to admit that there were Batei Mikdash by their own testimony. And my beloved friend and congregant from Fairfield, Connecticut, still has. I told him, you never give this up. We're going to need it. And when we're reciting these Kinot, we should have in mind, starting out of order, dafka out of the Seder, with this Kinah L'Chorban, Shel Simchat Torah, Taf Shin Pei Dalet, written by Zev Meir Shandlov. And let's open this morning reading this Kinah. Micha higiu lachgo, Torah Kedosha, Piton Predatchem Elai Kasha. Tulutai v'churai alchu b'shavi, Adonai l'cheik mishpachti tachazireni, be'eri zikim sederot libli, shachu shovi gevyam adkirim, tamu malkir teinem leinativ l'sad libam, haaretz hamas, hatzur agleihem b'dam, udmei tinoko atzuakim min adama, yekon niflotecha, שסיפרו באהבה, אוי הוי מחוב כמחובי, נקם נקמה דם עבדיך, ברוח קדימה זה, רחם ציון כדבריך, והעלינו מעמק הבכה. The first word of the next Kinah on page 152 in the Kinot is shavat, a cessation. Something stopped, came to a standstill. Bela Chaim was born in 1938 in Europe and is living on Kibbutz Gvulot in Otef Aza. And she refers to the 7th of October as Hayom HaShoah HaSheni Sheli. She said, I spoke with her in February. It was a trip with the Conference of Presidents. And she explained that she heard thunder and she didn't know what the sound was. In the morning of October 7th, she thought it was strange that it would be raining. And of course, then she got the call. And she said she closed her eyes. She didn't want to believe that this is actually happening to me again. And, the time when we met with her, she was also grieving the loss of her grandson, Yotam Chaim, who was taken captive and tragically was killed in a friendly fire accident in Gaza. And you hear these stories over and over and over again about people who were just absolutely shocked. I want to tell you a story about silence that I don't know if it's been publicized. I didn't see it online. We met with someone named Aaron Massas. Aaron Massas, married, 4 young children, lives in Kiryat Ata. Kiryat Ata is near Haifa. His brother Avi called him on 10/7 in the morning, and he just said to him, "Wake up right now, we just lost the country." So he turns on the TV, and the first image he sees is Hamas is in Sderot. So Aaron Massas spent 25 years in Sahel, so he thought, it's fate. I need to do something. Again, he lives near Haifa. He said, where's the army? Where's the police? Where's the IAF? And he realized there's a voice within him that says that something bigger is happening. So like a child, he says, I start thinking, I'm going to go, I'll find them and I'll stop them. He has no idea what's going on. He says, I'm not Superman. It would take me to get to Sderot, probably 12 hours. There's probably so many people on the road. So until I get there, it'll take a long time. He took his handgun and he put on his old uniform, and he lied to his wife. He told her, I just got called by someone in Sahel. I have to go to Sderot. No one called him, told him to go to Sderot. He literally got in his car in Kiryat Ata, Haifa, and he started driving south. And he saw no one on the road. He said he saw no traffic, no cars. He got to Tzomet Paz at the entrance to Patish, and he can't understand why is the whole thing destroyed. So he calls a friend at Patish, and he asks him to get to Sderot. But the friend tells him, listen, there's 300 or so kids from a party, and some are injured, and they're actually there in the vicinity. They think they're at some kind of a gas station that's right there at Tzomet Paz. He looks around, Aaron Massas, he says, there's no army, there's no police, and I'm literally realizing I'm in charge. He says, so I get to this Tzomet, and I see there's all sorts of kids. He said, I don't know how this happened, but I saw that there was a gym nearby, and I took the kids to a gym, and they're reporting to me, the kids are telling me, we saw on TV that 22 people were killed. He takes them into a gym, and he's with the kids, and they keep asking him, so when is the army going to get here? So he tells them, don't worry, it won't be long. And he sees in the kids' eyes how much they trust him. He says, magically, I don't know how, but somewhere, I don't know who did this till today. This was in February, he told us this. 3 buses appeared, like coach buses appeared. And the kids start running to cram onto the buses. And he tells them, I'm in charge now. He tells the buses, you have to take these kids. And the drivers keep saying, no, we can't. We're not able to. We're trying to get out of here. He said, listen, he said to one of the bus drivers, a fellow Jew, he said, there's 2 options. Either you're going to take all of these kids well beyond how many you could fit on this bus, or I'm going to shoot you right now in the leg. And the driver agreed. A news anchor shows up and starts filming. It's apparently a very well-known anchor in Israel. You could find the clip online. Her name is Adva. And in the middle of her interviewing him, he says to her, please shut it off. My family's going to see it. And she says to him, you don't understand. You are in charge here. The kids, they trust you. They believe in you. Suddenly, his phone is ringing, and it's people on the phone asking if he saw their children. No one's answering their phones. So he decides to drive to the Re'im party to see if there are any more survivors. The kids tell him there was a party, we ran away from it. 2 kilometers from Patish, he sees a Yamam vehicle. That's the special police vehicle, and it was destroyed. He said, now I'm afraid. So he continues driving, and he sees bodies on the side of the road. And he starts realizing no one is going to believe me. Nobody is going to believe that I actually saw this, that this is really happening. He says, as I'm driving with one hand, I'm taking pictures with my other hand on the phone. He said, I'm not releasing those pictures. He says the army has them. He said, I'm literally driving through a Hitchcock film. I'm in hell. How do you describe such a thing? He sees 2 officers that are shot, that are on the ground. And there's a Hamas terrorist sitting in a car their eyes meet as he's driving. He's holding the phone, and he's holding the steering wheel, and he throws down the phone, and on the seat next to him, he has his gun. He picks it up. He's a faster shot, and he takes him down with five bullets. And he gets out of the car. He takes a picture of the dead Hamas terrorists, and no one's going to believe me. But here's why I tell you this whole story to open the Kinot today. He was essentially the first person who got to the festival. There was a kilometer of vehicles with young people dead in the vehicles, killed at point blank range. And he stops and he goes out of the car and he's walking all over the place, step by step. He told us there were bodies in the worst shape he had ever seen. It was like the Shoah, what he imagined, they're burned bodies, 6 or 7 bodies you can see smoldering in a pit. He took a photo of it. He said, I will not share it. Of course, as he's telling us this story, he stops to cry over and over and over again. And he says, I look 360 degrees around me. I'm pretty much alone here in hell. And then I realized the silence. He said, there was a silence that I cannot explain. I was writing these notes down furiously as he was talking. I said, I want to bear aegis to this. So I'm writing while Iran is telling us this, the leadership of the Conference of Presidents. He says, for me, every time there was silence, I hope now, since that day, I hope the devil will not come to take me, because I know that when I was there, the devil was all around me. I was there for an hour and I saw death in all of its shapes. So now I realized the only thing that I can do left is I'm going to try to collect as many bodies as I can and put them in my car, because Hamas will soon come back to destroy the bodies. By this point, he says, 4 or 5 soldiers have arrived. They don't have any commanding officer. So I lie to them too, and I tell them, I'm in charge here. Like I told the children, I'm in charge. Like I told my wife, I was called. He said there was a body of someone there who had a knife in their hand. Someone who had been at the party. He said, I wasn't thinking straight. I needed the knife because I needed to be able to put bodies in my car. So I don't know what I was thinking. So I took the knife off of this body, but I had a pen in my pocket. He said, I know this will sound crazy, but I wrote on the body's arm, Iran took a knife from you on this day, 10/7. He said, I wrote it on the hand of the body. He said, I sat down on my knees before the first body, he says, I'll call her Lady in Green. I don't know her name, obviously, a teenager. She was face down, not wearing very much by way of clothing. I sat on my knees before her and I said to her, I need to dress you and to touch you, to take you to a safe place now. I apologized over and over again. And he said he did this. He loaded bodies literally into his car. That by then more Chayalim were arriving, and they were just working together. There's no one there. And he said, I have no idea how many bodies we took. 4 hours, 5 hours of just going over and over again, trying to get bodies out of there. And my uniform was filled with blood, ashes, pieces of flesh. Later, the army arrived in a more organized way, and I joined them at 4 a.m. The count was we had rescued 240 bodies. We collected them to one place, and we were putting them in the trucks and the vehicles. He said, 3 days later, I was already fighting in Gaza. But here's what you need to realize, and this is what he ended with, and this is how we're opening the first of the Kinot, the Shabbat, with the silence. He said, when I got there, and I saw the row of cars, a kilometer of cars, and it's just me, and there's no one there, I start screaming, Mishtara, Tzahal, Tsu'im, and no one answers. No one answers. Said, and we're going through, and then when a few of the Chayalim first arrive, we're still looking, maybe somewhere. And the only line that you keep hearing over and over again is the screaming of us saying, Yesh po mishu b'chayim, sheitem lam siman chayim. But there's nothing but silence that greets us. That's the silence of Shabbat. With that, we open Kinot. And we think a little bit about the fact that in Yerushalayim Yer HaKodesh, at the time of the Churban, one of the things that characterized it in the wake of the immediate aftermath of the Churban, Bayit Rishon and Bayit Sheni, was this heavy, heavy silence. Page 152. Shabbat Suru Meni Shimuni Uvrai, Sechim Ma'oz, Simri Be'edri Chalirai, Sakot Mishkan, Skot Efirai, Sakot Hufu Giburai, Safkukav, Madu Evarai, Kisilako, Apirai, Naflo, Sukuya, Nifik Telefazan Bref, Abdule Gilgal Chafia, and Yavani Kuya, Sa, Vikuya, Nama Ela, Korea, Abnei Farad, Tsuhasida, Pagesu, Zafra, Karisodea, Pachet Shilo, Tamav Sodea, Atsu, Hazira Yar, Yehasida, Plazamasena, Yudea, Versatsium Yadel, Hartzion, Sodishan, Midanite, Safra Koroshe, Sion Zidonite, Samtu, Benov, Lamor, Zidonite, Sword Natsar, Tahora, Midanite, Sabak, Ami. Atokol and Ikhbaratum Edi Kirafto Karat Yoshi Givo and Otames Lashmi Baara Vigrimuni Kumi Abori Hatel everybody Karat Mahavai Hemari Lamarua Hape Lotava Shamar Itaki Tanu Ram tomorrow. Really, Amal Vachas, Biagamor, after Biad Cheskel, Moru, Benachim, Migoi, Amor, Adonai, Sarlin, Achamar, Maru, Nashivain, Sisi, Shima, Ligoi, Tsea, Skatzirai, Lahad, Kien, Siftain, Shur, the people of Hadivain, Shmat, Zamor, Avekin, Tatain, Shachavu, Venadu, Chatzas, Havrin, Shamu, Ani. Tam Chakta, B'Cheso Fanechu, receive by him, Kaz, Chazot Fanecha, Tirdof, Futsam, when you ought say, Yalts Fanecha, Zema, Behav, not to say, Pinim Necha, Tikra, L'Shakra, Kos, Kamuz, B'Finim, B'Adru, Adam Fanecha, Tavo, El Tzar, Sher Kilanu, Imvo Chamad, B'Chemon, Yalanu, Adlach Allah, B'Chavor, Higlanu, Zikain B'Chur, V'Tula, Kivalanu, Ram habet no mcha kulanu zakor Adonai hayilanu. In that Shabbat Suru that we just read, we should be mindful of the fact that it mentions the Pachad Chet Shiloh. The Pachad Chet Shiloh means that eventually the Mishkan that was in Shiloh was destroyed. It's recounted in Sefer Shmuel Aleph. And during the time period of the first Beit HaMikdash before its destruction, one of the things Yirmiyahu Hanavi would try to tell the people is there was a destruction already. Don't you see that in Shmuel, at the time of Shmuel, the Sefer then was already written by then, for the end of Bayit Rishon. Don't you read the story that because of various sins, Shiloh was destroyed? So Yirmiyahu is always trying to tell the people in Perek Zion, he's the part right before we read today is the Haftorah. Yirmiyahu Hanavi keeps telling the people that Hashem told him to say that they should go on a trip. They should go visit what happened in Shiloh. Kilechuna el Mekomi asher b'Shiloh asher shikanti shmisham barishona ru'u et asher asiti lo mipnei ra'at ami Yisrael. So the Navi actually describes that the people should go take a trip to see Shiloh. By the way, you can go today. I have not yet been. I'm not Zocheh, but I know many in our Shiloh have been to the site. We know where the Shiloh, where the Mishkan Shiloh was located. And Yirmiyahu was telling the people, I'm going to do to this place, to the Mikdash, what I did to Shiloh. But the Nevi'ei Sheker, they always get the headlines because they're always sharing the good news. I use the expression advisedly. They bring the good news. And the good news is, Al tiftechu lachem al divrei hasheker limor. Don't listen. Yirmiyahu keeps telling the people, stop listening to their lies. They're just lying to you. What do they keep saying? The mantra that they keep saying is, Heichal Hashem, Heichal Hashem, Heichal Hashem, Hema. That's the pasuk. It describes it. They say the sanctuary of God. God would never destroy his sanctuary. God would never allow bad things to happen. So Yirmiyahu tells them, but it did happen in Shiloh. Yeah. I want to draw a hard and fast line between things that happen at a time when they're in Nevi'im and when the Ribono Shel Olam conveys to us exactly what we're doing wrong and exactly why the bad things are happening, versus what happens after the Churban of the Batei Mikdash, particularly the second Beit HaMikdash. We have no Nevi'im. We do not have anyone who can tell us definitively why the bad things happen. We don't know the reason. And after the exile, the second exile, by Sheni, the truth is we lived with a sense of Hester Panim. Everything that happened after that. So I learned from my Rebbe, Mori Rav Lichtenstein Zatzal, we have to tread very, very carefully before we decide we know why something terrible happened in the world. We're going to find, we know what the sin is, we know this, that. Rav Lichtenstein was always very upset about this. After the tsunami, remember the tsunami, 2004 to 2005, and it was the end of the year. People were getting up and saying all kinds of crazy things. The people, 100,000 people who died, they deserved it. They did this wrong, that wrong. He was very, very angry about this. He spoke about it. It's a published piece. How could a person deign that they know that they know? My father, Stark, used to be the driver for Mori Rabbi, Rav Pinchas Hirschsprung, who's the chief rabbi in Montreal. He was a survivor. He'd run away to Shanghai. A whole story. We'll read a piece from him a little later, maybe. And he lost his entire family. He was the chief rabbi in Montreal. My father used to drive him to shul a couple of times a week to the Aguda. My father once asked him, so Rebbe, I have to ask. I've always been meaning to ask. I don't know who else to ask. You're the chief rabbi. He said, why did the Shoah happen? So my father asked him. Hirschsprung said, after 120 years, when I leave the world, when I go to Shemayim, standing before the Kisei HaKavod, I will not ask Hashem why, because I don't want to hear the answer. I would submit that one thing we do have to keep in mind is that because the Torah tells us in Sefer Dvarim, Perek Yud Aleph, we're going to read it in a couple of weeks about Im Aleinu Tova, we'll get to Parshat Ekev, that in Eretz Yisrael things are different. Eini Hashem Elokecha ba, the God's being Doresh the land and the people in the land. Who can know what the sins are? Who can know? I don't know if anybody has to be a Navi to know that the enemies of the Jewish people see that when there's internal dissension, they know it's their time to pounce. They know. They see internal weakness. Nasrallah Yamashim of Zichro, from his rat hole, wherever he is in Lebanon, in his attack hole. He was giving speeches last year in the summer saying, you see, the Jews are about to go to civil war against each other. There's only a matter of time, he said. I don't think they'll reach their 80th birthday. That's what he said. Nasrallah Yamashim. They found in the plans of the Hamas also that the internal dissension is what's going to encourage people to do what they need to do and will not permit the Jews to defend themselves. They won't be able to. Who's responsible for the Churban? Everybody knows the story, Kamsa Bar Kamsa. You'll remind yourself the story later. You'll look it up online. The story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa, the Gemara Gittin. Fewer people know the story. That is a very simple story, but that has to do just with individuals. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav, says the Gemara in Gittin, "My dichtiv v'ashku gever ubeito v'ish nachlato," and it tells the following story. Based on the pasuk, and they oppress a man in his house, and even a man in his heritage. There was a man who was a carpenter's apprentice, Shulei Nagar. And he was interested in his mentor's wife. And this Shulia Denagre, the apprentice, hatches the following plan. His mentor needed to borrow money. So he told the master, listen, I have a lot of money, but it's a 3 days journey from here. Send your wife with me on a 3-day trip. I'll give her the money. The husband says, okay. The wife goes. And she disappears. So the apprentice comes back without the wife. And the boss says to him, where's Ishti Shishigarti La Heichani? So the apprentice says, I don't know, I let her go immediately. Vishamati Shatinokani to Alu Baba Derech. I heard that she was assaulted by Tinoko, here means like teenagers, teenage boys assaulted her. So the master says to the apprentice, Ma'aseh, what should I do? Amarlo, he said to him, if you want to listen to my counsel, the apprentice says to the mentor, Gersha, you should divorce her immediately. So the master says, well, I can't do that because the ketubah that I will owe her that we wrote in the ketubah is a very large sum. I don't have that kind of money. The apprentice says, oh, don't worry. I'll lend you more money and you could pay her off. Amad Zeva Gershon. So this man divorced his wife and the apprentice promptly found a wife and he married her. When the time came and the master didn't have the money to pay back his apprentice, the apprentice said to him, you know what? Why don't you come to work for me? The mentor, the master, the carpenter now works for the apprentice. The Gemara concludes, the new husband and wife, the apprentice and the former wife of the carpenter, who are now married to each other, are sitting, eating and drinking. Who's the servant? The master is the servant. His tears were flowing from his eyes, and they were dropping into their cups as he's pouring them the drinks. On that hour was the decree sealed for Klal Yisrael. The Maharsha in this Gemara says, Gam she'averat yachid haya, kivan she'haya bi'adam linchot v'michu nechtam gzar din lekulam. The Maharsha writes that the fact is that the sages should have made some kind of a protest that this terrible story happened. It was an individual story, but they didn't speak up. And he thinks that's the problem. I want to ask a different question. Who's actually at fault here? You'll tell me, obviously, the apprentice. What a conniving, manipulative, terrible person who ruined the household. It's true. He is terrible. What about the wife? In this story, she's an object, not a subject. She doesn't speak. We don't hear from her. She's married to this one, then she's married to that one. She didn't speak up in protest. And what about the carpenter, who was supposed to be the mentor, who was supposed to be the one offering guidance to the apprentice? How did he let himself go along with that? You'll tell me it's blaming the victim. I'll tell you, you're probably right on a certain level. But on another level, in this case, it took three to be involved in this terrible, terrible story. Nechashuke Chemed, Rav Zilberstein on this Gemara, points out in the name of the Hemek Davar that the Torah here, when it says Lo tachmod eshet reyacha, means don't try, even within the law, within the confines of the law, to figure out how you're going to cause so-and-so to get divorced so you could marry them. Why do I tell you that story now? Because in the end, so much of this really does have to do with individuals and how they conduct themselves, and the moral character of individuals, and the spiritual character of individuals. And if we don't take care, Khalila, on a personal level, feel a personal sense of responsibility, an individual, who knows, but an individual could be in charge, God forbid, of having sealed the din of Klal Yisrael. Mi'idach Gisa, Eran Masas, and other heroes we'll be hearing about and hearing from later today. We'll hear from two Chayalim at 5 o'clock, and other Chayalim who are with us this morning without mentioning names. An individual can tip the scales in the other direction. And we're doing that, hopefully, through the acts of chesed and beautiful things we're trying to do. If you look on page 162, we turn to Adad. Adad Chut Shamayim. They say every year the same thing, Aleph, 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 Aleph. It's an individual, solitary, alone. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. You know? We read together a solitary testament about a person in deep, deep, abject grief, trying to understand what they're going to do, and in the end, they do none of it. The one sentence I want to show you here to point out toward the end, Ayada lakol kimudat zot, that this is going to be the last Tisha B'Av. It's in this Kina. I'll tell everybody. This is the end. The salvation is here. This is the last Tisha B'Av. It's the end. It's the end. And every year Jews think maybe it's the end. There was a time before time when we never printed books for Kinot. That changed in the 20th century. The Kinot books were only always those pamphlets where you could hardly read what was going on. No translations, no commentaries. Because we said it'll never be. We won't need it again. Now I think we started publishing it because we know when Mashiach comes very, very soon, we're going to need to have a museum where we're going to talk still about these events that happened. And we'll understand them in a different way, but we'll need to see how did people process their grief in those days. Please, let's read together Adeh, page 162. Adeh Chuk Shemayim, Ala Iti Shemayim, Yom Achri Pamayim, Edonein Mi'itin Rosh Shemayim. Avchin B'chi, Leil Midbar, Avchana, Leil Midbar, Avchana, Leil Midbar, Midbar. Vaki Iti Ola Midbar, Eshag Midnein Midbar. Egoda Venos, Yinokev Zaid, Agara Iti, Gobne Vayi, Egrom Shiomar Baha, Bayi, Arosha Midnein, Samir Vasai. Adve B'cholev Lahamsiyehu, Eid Milin. Bam Amitsehu, Edag Aye, Roev, Lemsehu, Akone, Eatinadati, Sehu, Hofchav, Et Hapcha, Keofan, Bemilai, Yaponim, Banim, Tanod, Amalai, Ahahu, Cheres, Vasar, Gielumai, Etzrak, Mitenefo, Yikad, Formilai, Ora, Mishputagon, Eli, Odia, Vivitsi, Umali, Umlu, Masala, Bikari, Meili, Afa, Mite, Smeali. Azda Yofra Yona Eskra Yiti Makutana Azil Pologi Precha Yona Egor Miyitin Eber Kayona Apnipsa Mikirat Ozel Sor Achublima Yin Aflat Sor Askamotik Sor Valil Sor Sichami Ovilain Adoli Apatni but some of it, a Tusa Shkonat hot some of it. The Tofel, the Machakim Lamovet, and Hemi Gever, Yichev Lear Movet, Yalut Lesrot, Itarti Hazot, Ayumad, Ilposhana Merit, Yasan Azot, Ayadalako, Kimudad Zot, Ilo, Kiyad, Adonai Astazot, Yacharos, Adonai Cheli, Echra, Lechaber, Lechate, El Machli. Achtir Chabshim Shir Mecholi, Achavem, Yiten Chachli, Tishach Tzakar, Ariel, Love, Lego, Yehudov, Israel, Avishina Shemasar, Limor, Mite, Mitzion, Shuat, Israel. Israel made Birachai, Halachu, Azafuni Vazaftim, Fanai, Mayam Nebachu, Raganti, Behilalti, Umayai, Velibi Nishbachu, Echa, Tifarti, Meirashotai, Hislichu. The next Kinot, page 174. Again, we just can't say all of them. We're too limited. We just can't. If we said all the Kinot that we have, we'd literally not get up till 5, 6 o'clock at night. It's just not possible. Just not possible. You could go home and say the rest for yourself later. So we're kind of just saying just some of them. There's no two ways about it. I always come back to this Kinot, page 174. It's kind of a long Kinot, but it is the only living memorial that we have to the names of the 24 Mishmarot, the 24 orders of Kohanim that used to serve in the Mikdash. The Mishnah and the Gemara and Tana describes this. They were 24 groups of Kohanim. They were the Miluim. They went to the Makom HaMikdash and they would do the service in the Beit HaMikdash. Every week was another Mishmar, had a turn. Those of us who learned the Gemara in Sukkah, we talked about how on Yom Tov, everybody would come together, all the Mishmarot, all hands on deck. So everybody would get together. The Kohanim also served a function as teachers. They were the teachers, the Torah says so. The Shevet Levi, particularly Kohanim, were in charge of teaching. Think about famous Kohanim, Ezra HaSofer, etc. But in general, that was the role of Kohanim to do that. And therefore, there was an element of wanting to look to them for guidance. Oftentimes, that was the point. And yet, so often, unfortunately, they also weren't necessarily Nevi'im, and they didn't always know. And in Eicha Yashva, on page 174, you'll see there's a line here, Vikani bi'ivaron of a shigaon. I was struck with blindness and madness. And the blindness and the madness is probably an allusion to the fact that Tzidkiyahu HaMelech, the last king of the first Commonwealth by Rishon, sadly, when Nuvuzaradan, the butcher from Bavel, arrived, So he killed Tzidkiyahu's children in front of him, and then he gouged out his eyes. He blinded him, and then they took him prisoner to Bavel. A terrible story. That was actually in the year 586 when that happened. And that was the time exactly of the Khurban. But I think on another level, it also refers to the idea that leadership so often is blind. It's not unless it's prophecy. So how are they supposed to know? And people make mistakes. They simply don't know. In hindsight, things look 2020, but in prospect, who knows? In 1937, Zev Jabotinsky, whose yahrzeit was just now, within the last few days, he spoke in Warsaw in 1937 on Tisha B'Av. And he said, "It is already 3 years that I'm calling upon you, Polish Jewry, for the crown of world Jewry. I continue to warn you incessantly that a catastrophe is coming closer. I became gray and old in these years. My heart bleeds that you, dear brothers and sisters, do not see the volcano which will soon begin to spit its all-consuming lava. I know you are not seeing this because you are immersed in your daily worries. Today, however, I demand your trust. You are convinced already that my prognoses have already proven to be right. If you think differently, then drive me out from your midst. However," continued Jabotinsky, "if you do believe me, then listen to me in this 11th hour. In the name of God, let any one of you save himself as long as there is still time. And time, there is very little. And what else I would like to say to you in this day, on Tisha B'Av, whoever of you will escape from the catastrophe, he or she will live to see the exalted moment of a great Jewish wedding, the rebirth and the rise of a Jewish state. I don't know if I will be privileged to see it. My son will. I believe in this, as I am sure that tomorrow morning the sun will rise." This was Jabotinsky's last Tisha B'Av message to his largest and most loyal constituency. Within a short time, both he and they would be gone. Certainly was not a prophet, Zev Jabotinsky, but that was literally the speech he gave on Tisha B'Av, 1937, in Warsaw, the largest Jewish community at that time. Yod Pat will be mentioned here. In early June of the year 67, now it's 2024, Leminyanam. So in 67, a force of 1,000 cavalrymen arrived at Yod Pat to seal off the town. Roman cavalrymen, followed later, a day later, by the entire Roman army. Vespasian himself pitched his own camp north of the town, facing its only accessible side, while the forces surrounded the city. They began an assault on the wall. In one of those caves inside was Yosef ben Matityahu, a Kohen, who was one of the prominent citizens of Yod Pat. And he himself, Yosef ben Matityahu, was in favor of surrendering to the Romans. The majority of his comrades opted to kill themselves rather than to fall in the Roman hands. Matityahu stayed alive, and they resolved to give themselves up. They were taken to see the Roman general, and Matityahu told Vespasian that he thought one day he would be the emperor. And so Vespasian spared the rebel leader, who had began collaborating with the Romans. Later, when he was granted Roman citizenship, his name was changed to Flavius Josephus, as we know him, and he has the only living record that we have contemporaneous secular history to what transpired at the time of the Khurban. The trouble, of course, is that nobody knows whose team he was on. On the 47th day of the siege, when the ramp had surpassed the walls, one deserter went over to the Romans, disclosed the entire dire situation in Yod Pat, and few defenders actually remained. And these were worn up a perpetual fighting and vigilance. They usually slept during the last watch of the night. And then came the fall. And as for the Romans, Josephus himself would write later in his book, Wars of the Jews, they so remembered what they had suffered during the siege that they spared none nor pitied any. They drove the people from Yod Pat down the precipice from the citadel, and they slew them as they drove them down, at which time the difficulties of the place hindered those that were still able to fight from defending themselves. For as they were distressed in the narrow streets, they could not keep their feet sure along the precipice. They were overpowered with the crowd of those that came fighting them down from the citadel. It's a quote from Wars of the Jews. According to Josephus, 40,000 people were either slain or committed suicide, and 1,200 women and infants were taken into slavery. The Romans, according to Josephus, suffered but a single fatality in the conflict at Yod Pat. Vespasian ordered the town demolished and the walls torn down, and the Romans prohibited the burial of the fallen. It was a year later, when the Jews could come back to bury the dead of Yotzpat. Page 174, we read together. All the words in bold are either taken from Eicha or are the names of those 24 units of Kohanim who so often had to become soldiers to defend Eretz Yisrael. Ufshata, Mishmeret, Mifshata, Rachehecha, Shamot, Mifratz Katlo, Yokin Krab Tilo, Murad, Shbam Tilo, Vanamishitilo, Kohen, Aitalo, Vim, even Belochem Lechem, Vitlu, Halo, Faros, Arev Lechem, Bahur Avu, Bahud, Smau, Bimaim Milechem, Kivutlu, Shtei Halechem, Nibei Lechem. Yetze Hadar Kesef Nechpad Utmuro Efer Shachipat Nera Nichbu Umenara Nichpad Yefoshu Belach Mufa Nukudayot Pad Zachra Zman Asher Nasev Imtza Hishivu Va'ata Anot Amen Bo'avu Bo'ana Varosh Subu V'Ravu V'Huktu V'Hul Avu Kohani Aylabu Chet Chatar Leozel Higa Tif Choseel, Vorkain, Bukna, Margizel, Etzimonel, Gefarziel, Mota, Echnif, Tevil, Vanal, Rava Chovel, Ava Graglav, Gavel, Carbel, Bechwane Arbel, Yado Paras, Tsar, Beved Zur, Kichalaya, Chuyav, Tikidur, Mabu, Chisoishid, Lechibuv Nibul, Reitze Bechever, Kabul, Kohen Kavul. Kolam Karanukina, Kichisul Ilkana, Begoina Valo Tamkina, Lamikina, Kana, Lulamuramai in Safar, Kazavera, Hipat, Mechizik Musar, Horpa, Neras, Nilpat, Coin Safar, Mora Mishmian, Elati to own, Kanabi Varona, Shigon, Fakaralai, Afonov, Givon, Benami Mor, Mishmera, Bay Coin, Maon, Niskaro, Lavon Venichav, Kihushavti, Yaguna, Miblia, Venimati, Milatsafse, Veminim Gugav. Nasa like Kinot, Mishmerat Yesh Ve'av, Sila Bira, Imore, Horaya, Veloniskar, Liakidat Moria, Umeiro, Mered, Umeria, Utsaga, Iron Veria, Mishmerat Madya, Gabi Harashu, Horashim, Veri, Humanid, Vikolai. Al-Kharev V'Chanid, V'Yabeit, Tzomot V'Tanid, Mitzvah, Tochnid, Yatzah Yavanid, Persa, V'Yen Yad Shuleach, Gilo Emina, V'Ashkem V'Shaloach, Who's Betabarid, Melach, Ben Shemen, Mamulach, Rosh Mamlach, Tzadiku Adonai Kifiu Marad, Arad Yisod Bahu Arad, Morazi V'Simrat, Kinim Na'alev Nechrav, Gazayeret, Israel, Karad, L'Tzuri V'Kolil Harav, V'Nandi V'Yav Harav, Chavaner Adoleg Marav, V'Reichel Harav, Machal Harav, Reiki Husarti, Koniyah, Betoni Avaniyah, Ukehali, Katsulan Tevach, Minuya, Vinamik Minuya, Migdal Munia, Shamu, Kiyatsati, Vashivya, Venizra, Vodat, Maram, Shibuya, Ushati, Lashama, Arbuvia, Mehester, Chabuya, Nada, Beethovia, Shamu, Kinis Hamti, Vitzachana, Zad, Mani, Techina, Natani Racham, Vanina, Kiyat Hanana, Gifar, Hana, Tavorat, Samuni, Adamin, Shadu Sarai, Sumim, Beshiva Hoyamin, Vavon, Basilino, Ginton, Samin. Tavo tamriach v'choshki tazriach v'chadesh atzmotenu tafriach reach nichochenu kikedem tariach mshulchancha tariach shulei chamat ariach. The next kina that we read, page 182, kina 11, is a reworking of the kina that Yirmiyahu Hanavi spoke about Yoshiyahu HaMelech. It's actually a reworking because the original is chapter 4 of Megillat Eicha, according to the tradition, Eicha Yuam Zahav. But here the Mekonim reworked it and gave us more details about the story. If by now it's already hard for you to read everything in Hebrew and you're not so fluent, by all means, you'll read in English while we're reading in Hebrew. After Yoshiyahu HaMelech died, pretty much the only defense the Jewish people had against Churban from a spiritual perspective was one thing, the Aleph Bet. That's all they had left. Like many of the Kinot, it goes in the Aleph Bet. There was that's all there was. The end of the Kina here says the composition of Eicha by Yirmiyahu used the 22 letters of the Aleph Bet in order to enable the delay of the Churban by 22 years. So the delay of the Churban as a result. And that's what we're reading now. Yirmiyahu Hanavi himself led a very, very tragic life. I sometimes imagine if you met like famous people from Tanakh, I imagine if you met Yirmiyahu, he would be a very depressed individual with everything that he lived through. Barbanel says the reason why the book of Yirmiyahu starts Divrei Yirmiyahu instead of just Chazon, like Chazon Yeshaya or Yechezkel or other Svarim, only two books that start with Divrei Yirmiyahu and Divrei Amos, is because the books contain a lot of personal information about their lives and how they suffered sometimes at the hands of Jews while they were just trying to do their job. They were put in prison. In the case of Yirmiyahu, he was beaten almost to death at one point by fellow Jews. They didn't like his message, and they tried to take him down in order to prevent hearing the terrible message of Churban that sadly proved all too true. Page 182, by Yikonen Yirmiyahu. Yen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu Chayeli Kanamei Love. Shmoneh Cheli Drosh Melchav. Ram Chanu Allah V'Skailo Ziguim Yifalo. Gam B'Chol Malchei Yisrael Asher Kamu Ligdor. V'Kam Kamu Mimot Avigdor. Davak Bo Chet Leitzanei Hador Asher Kamu Achar Delet Lizdor. Ochli Zera Shikor. Kmo Atov Bichamo Mishchor. V'Yigdal Avon V'Shiv Yaminachor. O Lo Shalach Yado Minachor. Zaku Amarav Kinamdad L'Hakim. Bitza Emrato V'Arush L'Yakim. Hashach Torah Kinot Ruchukim B'Vet Samoa Seidat Ruchukim Tovim Royi Mikro B'Sholcho Malach Mali Valach Ayol Mutalach Yidei Yam Haaretz Damim B'Malach Te'aned V'Vitzi Et Pnei B'Lach Kila Amonai Lechet Aram Noraim L'man Lo Davor Cherev Gozu B'Ephraim Shmalach Hozel L'Shuv Achoraim Gigzer Nigzera L'Sachsech Mitzrayim Mitzrayim Mechatot Stirot Mezuzot Chazon Antoti Hechil Vazod No Anomi Melchum Lahavzod Lo Hesek Panav Saft Vazod Sur Heido Ad Lo Shia Yamanu Sur Umad Yisod Nishia Nekrav Kikare V'Lo Lo Ritia Mayoru Amorim Melech Yoshia Adenu Otsemina V'Gev Yono Chatzim Chetz Achar Chetz Morim V'Lo Chatzim Sadu V'Samur Chamatara Lachitzim Zikubo Shlosh Meot Chitzi Kalim Hitu Acharav Ezon Motzafiu V'Ad Mitzui Get Nefesh Masav Hifiu Rosvatav Yitzam Yipihu Tzadiku Adonai Ki Mariti Fihu Sisino Ikine Zam L'Shalem Shonam Bavon Bitzam Tam Kedem Atovam Zub V'Fasham Ikanin Alav Kolicha Yuam Tam Benikrecha Kos Migdal Ishtot V'Ichnat Hashmita Giga Keletot Ta B'Simushtayim Eharos Shatot Kisavta Lo Eicha B'Simushtayim Otiot Otot Kinot Ubatam Mecholi Eit Ki Shachachti Mecholili Zamoti Kilad Ahili Rashati V'Nasati Nutash Ohali. Again, one tzaddik, Yoshiyahu HaMelech, was able to prevent or at least delay the Churban because of the tshuva process that he tried to help Klal Yisrael engage. Page 188, how fragile, how vulnerable everything is. The reference to the Ohel as the place, the Mishkan, the Batei Mikdash, everything's referred to as an Ohel, a temporary dwelling in this regard. And of course, even after the Mishkan was built, it was referred to in the Torah as the Ohel Moed, to have a sense of the temporary element. The Shechina is described here as like a lonely bird sitting on a roof by itself. Again, you imagine it, a lonely bird on a rooftop, it's crying out, and there's no one there. There's no other birds even. It's just by itself. And that sense of being forlorn very much characterizes Kina on page 1. It is Kina Yud Bet. It's a misprint on the sheet, but it's Yud Bet, page 188. Holiyasher ta'avta, lovely sheet. Kisekavlut sarful amanat zachshudad biyad shrudim. Yato kiruebot yavras to garagan to adam aliko. Holy Asher Kumam Talei Tanei Eretz. Echad Am Yevo Anetz Tumad Biatzorim. Yeita Yitzipor Potei Agagma Tzorech Ma Yidifo. Lejebozol Mano Litzir Vat Amori Modifo Lamalanetz or Ar. That are really Yason Utsai Voy Moshapo. Asher Nachi Tavonei Hod. Lishno Po Veinenu Po Lamalanetz Moad Biad Mordim. Yea, the keyboard Luchal, Shiam Alchafo, Milchapo, Liasher Givando, the Holy the Holofe, the Hupo, Lamaneza, Yab, Yirim, the guitars, Kalal, Veno, Navi, Venam, Tohain, Po, Sir Hanit, Amias, with of Mipo, Lanetzach Sunach, Viadzore, the Givadi, Yotechut, of Po. Holy Asher Eichan, the Lashli, Bolafanech, Voralpo, Lamanetz, Abdu Chaviad, Dami, Miniate, Geger, Bores, Venam, Tilan, Asova, Bolopo. Holy Asher Babon, Bitsi, Hashechu, Kovei, Nishpo, Lamanetz, Upal, Biadumo, Vietic, Oreya, Bamalon, Rod, Milchafo. Achor v'akedem, mipo l'chodor v'ador. Noda kitzpo v'chupo, al meh mikol om shat alai kapo. Zot ba'alil ki v'fid, chakuk b'chapo, refuati b'tucha ki rega v'apo, v'arata eicha ya'iv v'apo. We turn now to page 226. Zechor asher asat sar b'finim. As Kinot actually describes the portrait of evil, describes Titus, Shchek Tamya. That's the Aramaic expression. It means may his bones be ground up. Titus, who was lionized and essentially canonized by the Romans, we know to be a great Rasha, a terrible sadist, reveled in the pain of others. And he's described here, and the portrait of him is described here. We need to know that the evil people are evil, because so often the world that forgets its moral bearings so blithely, so easily, with such facility, will find itself making portraits of people like Yahweh Sinwar, Yamach Shemo V'Zichro, in magazines in the United States. Ayin Sham, a profile of him within the last little while, sort of tries to kosher him up. A sinister man who was imprisoned in Israel for terror acts against Jews, who almost died of a brain bleed and was saved because a young Israeli doctor in the prison, actually a dentist in the prison, saw that something was wrong with his gait, with his walk, and he signaled it, and it turned out that he needed brain surgery to be saved, and he was saved. And he thanked his doctors in perfect Hebrew. But all the while, of course, he was biding his time to see when he could wreak havoc, murder, and mayhem. Titus has a whole discussion, this whole discussion in the Gemara, how he died. Okay, it's important to know how he died, because it's important to know that there was a certain punishment that he received, Mina Shamayim, for the terrible things that he did. In the time in which we live, we have shlichim who carry that out. When the head of Hamas, Yamach Shemo V'Zichro, who is literally a mass murderer, but is somehow koshered up as the so-called moderate, he's only moderate relative to the people who rape and murder and slaughter children and babies and put them in ovens. He's moderate, relatively speaking. But we see how the media, very, very upsetting to see, but charitably, very upsetting, somehow kasher up Hania and Shukr and all these people, Yamach Shema V'Zichram. But we do say even on Tisha B'Av, a certain Shreina Matov Chakenu, that we have a Klal Yisrael that is able, Bezrat Hashem, to engage in the Kama, to engage in these acts of bringing people to justice. An Eichmann trial we don't have time for in the middle of a war. There are other ways. Or whoever did whatever they did in Tehran. But the other ones, Medinat Yisrael admitted to. In Zechor et Asher Tzabafinim, there's also a focus here, mention of the children. Biladim Asher Ein Behem Kol Mum, Misham Lahafnot. Children were deported for terrible purposes from Eretz Yisrael to Rome. Lamarag Shagoim Lo Shata Lamincha Penot. Why was there some kind of emotional response from the nations, but God, you didn't respond to this gift that was given v'shilchum? They were sent instead like Eretz Utz b'shalosh sfinot. Rome was referred to here as Eretz Utz, which reminds us who is the only person who's from Eretz Utz. Ish hayav Eretz Utz Eov shemo ve'ishahu tam v'yashar v'yirei Elokim b'sar meira. The opening pasuk from Sefer Eov. When did Eov live? There's a debate in the Gemara in Bava Batra when he lived. He lived in this time, he lived in that time, back and forth. You know when he lived? Eov lives right now. In every generation, there are people who you could look to them and say, that person, Mamish, is Eov. Those children were going to Eretz Utz because they were living the experience of Eov. What had they done wrong? The Satan got his way, and they were shipped away on ships. The Gemara describes in Gittin, Nun Zayin Bet, Rabbi Yehuda, Mishmuel, Vitem, Rabbi Ami, Amram lo matnitatana, Maisa bedalad meot yeladim viladot shenash nishbu lekalam. Yergishu batzman lemahin mitvakshin. His 400 children on the ships, the 3 ships, they understood they were being taken for terrible purposes to Rome. So Amru, im anu tovim b'yam, anu bayin l'chaylam haba. These children, can you imagine, they're in grade school, they're in elementary school, declaring in the halacha. So we're going to get olam haba if we jump into the sea, or is it better to go and to be taken advantage of, to be abused in perpetuity, and maybe to grow up as Romans, lo aleinu? And they go back and forth, different psukim. The girls, when they heard this back and forth, it's always the girls that decide first. They're the ones, the heroes of Jewish people. They got up, they jumped into the ocean, into the Mediterranean. The boys made a kal v'chomer with themselves. If they did what they did, okay, without going into the details, we're gonna do what we have to do also. Upon them, the Sefer Tehillim cried, we're slaughtered for you all day. We're like lambs to the slaughter. There's a story from just about a year or so ago, last May. There's a claim that the Roman army may have included kosher observant Jews. According to a study that was done in the University of Pennsylvania, it's published by the JQR, Jewish Quarterly Review, that high numbers of Jews likely served in the legions that brought down Jerusalem and could have constituted even up to 15% of the vast empire's army. I don't understand what that means, except if it means that people came as children and they were raised as Romans, but they knew we keep kosher, we don't eat pig. So maybe, I don't know, speculative, but the children there said, we're not going to be those children. Zechor et asher asat tzar b'finim, the graphic descriptions of what happened in Yerushalayim, page 226. Shalach harbo v'alifnim Tzim B8 Tzimilach Mapanim Der Paroch et Bala Stefanim Tumki El Mugevatam They Kavi Maray Adam Dav Medala Isker Chitzam Dam Kiatzim Nabai Charmam Leadam Vitor Vodover Benotel El Gaber, Mitzrayim, Cholaom, Imban, Gavara, Vitoch, Ivuyo, Arutz, Elav, Savar, Batain, Zara, Kichlis, Bakura, Bakhlaish, Sezon, Soach, Nisunichba, Ish, Wadin, Chitu, Tocho, Labadesh, Amebevate, Is Mimor, Sholach, Ish, Minafshain, Tavana, Gahotzikle, Saray, Sama, Baoni, Shai, Bam, Sharay, Reno, Double Mark. Israel, Motsotishim, Mushlosha, Kilei, Mesharet, Nazim Kisoro, Kivaritz, Vikarka, Bain, Alavich Ritz, Sam Patu, Kubo, Faritz, Vikodesh Kodeshim, Sochnato, Shritz, Vichutz, Sargum, Chuzakim, Taru, Kiyuzak, Bit Shishim, Ribomasikim, Zikaim, Nivatu, Kihir Shuhu, Mish Hakim, Sod. Ritzon, Basur, Bazikim, Shabbat Sotain, Revoadmon, Besabev Choma, Vitamon, Afla Evran, in a pizza, Lach, Luz Armon, Kinot, Mitlok Armon, Petach Harabai, Ovo, Yar, Arba, Roshi Tafsir, Lahach, Rivo, outside my Rav, Zecher, Yisribo, Zephyr Kotlain, Rav, Rivo,
אתה קצבת ושאת לפנות ילדים אשר אין בהם כל מאום, משם להפנות למרגסו גויים, לשעת למנחה פנות, ושילחום בארץ עוץ, ושלוש ספינות, השיבנו סיברו גבעון בנבחי ים, ושיתפו עצמם יחד לנפול בים, שירו תשפחות שירו כעל ים, כי הלכו רגל מצוות ים, יתעמוד בו עד נפשם. לעשות בעד ולא שכח חנוכה, חילול ממשן, תקוות עמדת למשים במשן, ובת כל נשמעה אורה למה תישא. In case it's not already apparent, I'm struggling to make sure we talk about things other than October 7th. But it's so important to realize that the focus, particularly this year on October 7th, is to remind ourselves, even in the grief and the sadness, that actually it's all in the books. This is what the enemies of Klal Yisrael have already been doing. It's not news to us. It's a shock and it's terrible. No question. But there's precedent, sadly, in our history of the Kinot that were written. And unfortunately, as we're reading last night, reading again this morning, they're still being written. The Kinot are still being written. Yisrael Hayom carried a story just now at the end of June entitled "Like Sadistic Nazis." Secret Hamas papers reveal the step-by-step action plan for October the 7th. And the October 7th massacre, the article says, was not only explicitly directed at Israeli civilians, but was deliberately carried out by Gazan civilians who were an inherent part of the grand plan Hamas had devised. According to academic researchers in Germany and Israel, parts of this plan are reminiscent of practices used by the Nazis to exterminate European Jews, such as the use of Einsatzgruppen, the SS operational units that advanced in the wake of the German army's invasion of Eastern Europe and participated in the planned and systematic extermination of Jews. And the article details the various documents that have been uncovered and explains that Hamas is not just a terror army, it's also an organization that holds a modern ideology for the extermination of Jews. It is all by design. And the degree to which they co-opted many people who were not, quote unquote, formally part of the Hamas, but the popular mass mobilization was also part of the goal. The conquest of the Gaza border communities was a move long planned by the Hamas leadership. In another shocking handwritten document, also captured during the IDF ground maneuver in Gaza, the details of the Al-Aqsa flood. According to the document, Hamas' original goal was to take control of 221 settlements in the south, including the cities of Netivot, Ofakim, and Sderot, and to expel the quote-unquote settlers from them. And those were supposed to flee using their own cars, with priority to expelling women and children, taking men aged 17 to 50 as hostages. Hamas estimated that Israel would respond forcefully to the attack, and this document, official document, says not only with strikes, but also with an atomic bomb. According to the document, they were prepared to absorb even that. Looters arrived in waves. In waves they came. And you know that book from Daniel Goldhagen, they called it controversial, Hitler's Willing Executioners? Is a book that's going to be written called Hamas's Willing Executioners. The cruelty, said one of the people who studied this over the last few months, according to Hamas, the cruelty was supposed to be as graphic as possible because that's how you show your superiority. Hamas believes that if security is shaken, then Israel will just disintegrate. And this is very similar to the Nazi way of thinking. In this article, it describes Irit Lahav. Some of us in this room right now, when we're on the mission, in February, we met Irit Lahav in Nir Oz, a woman who quite literally drove Gazans to the hospital for years, was literally a peacenik of the highest order. And she locked herself in the safe room with her daughter and their dog. And she figured out how to use a vacuum cleaner to the hose to close the door, to lock it with improvising. And somehow in the safe room, she was able to lock the door. The entire day, she heard people coming and going in the afternoon and taking things from her house and laughing and eating, etc. Gazan women entered one of Lahav's neighbors' houses. The family was locked in their safe room, and they heard her turn on the TV and put on some program in Arabic for 4 hours, was preparing food and singing in Arabic in their home. The Gazans, says Lahav, entered the homes in Nir Oz and barely left any property behind. They took everything: shoes, sandals, bicycles, children's toys, cars, mobility scooters, tractors, agricultural machinery, electrical appliances, microwaves, TVs, mixers, the computers, the phones, the wallets. They took my kettle, they took my spoons, they took my knives. And of course, the kidnapping. The pyromaniacs didn't reach my neighborhood, but 60% of the houses near Oz were set on fire. They simply cut the gas pipe in the kitchen and they lit it. And the thing we really couldn't understand on our mission is that someone asked her, so do you still believe in peace? Would you still take Gazans in the car? And she said, yes. I would still take them to the hospital after this. Some of the group was very upset. They were peppering her with questions. I don't remember who I was talking to. Maybe someone from Kins, I think, standing on the side. I said, can you believe this, Rabbi? I said, this person, their whole world was just destroyed and their whole worldview was destroyed. Let's give her space to process it. And that's when she said that she would take someone in her car in the future, but she'd always be looking in the rearview mirror if the lady that she would be taking would be wearing her earrings stolen from her home. And she didn't know what she would do with that. Now turn to page 232. We read very, very graphic, horrible things that when you read them, I read them as a kid, I used to think that's probably an exaggeration or something, but it is not an exaggeration. None of this is an exaggeration. These things actually happened. And if you need to know an example when they happened, they just happened less than a year ago. Again, page 232. Tizman absar avad labanim bima'arav v'shichim alayli d'chuyavna banot d'chekimutam nitpuchim alayli m'tatusna ruchot olim b'chovet kiryat yafuchim alayli t'yakern absikhu rachem tzimuk shadayim banim shachim alayli t'kashal shmona mi'ot m'gini ba'arav haluchim alayli t'lu hatna rucham hey maluchim b'nodet nafuchim alayli Atna me elef me asar decha the mapachim alili to nos lamasa heicha shmonim elef kohanim parachim alili saraf nasham kolot nefash gekotsit kesuchim alili teirafna damnaki shmonim elef kohanim suchim alili parakachna. Nafsho Nudukor Miriat Nuvo Hod Sichim Alightly to Savarna Al Evan Sam Achat Tisha Kabi Mochilot Munachim Alightly to Kanishlosh Medion Kim also Achat Nud Metuchim Alightly in Tera and Harako Ranugod Kuvod Ayadrov Tabakim Alightly Tishka Ben Shvatani Benot Nadivim Bashulach Alightly the Lafna Habatubo Vabachu Bachurim Simon Sichim Alightly Ruach HaKodesh Marim Roy Al Kol Shecheinai Haroim Ma Shehi Kra'am Hodiim Be'ed Asher Sulam Hodiim Tulchan Shim Priyam Mashmiim Miareg Mitash Adonai Kohen V'Navi Mashmiim. Turn now to page 240. L'chashem Hatzdaka. It's actually one pasuk, L'chashem Hatzdaka V'lanu Bosh Tapanim, that's being repeated again and again and again. And before we go to that, Kinot, I just want to remind you of something that I already spoke about. It's what I found in February at Nir Oz, not when we went to shul, I was there the week later, the children's book that is outside the Siman Tov home. It's a children's book that's torn to shreds and half incinerated. And it's a story about animals at peace. The caption on the page is a picture of a sheep dressed in a dress, some kind of a hat, dancing with a wolf that's wearing a shirt and pants. And the caption on this page of this children's book says, "V'gam chayot haya'ar kartu b'neihem brit shalom, k'mosh katuv b'sefer Yeshaya, colon." And I assume on the next page, it's "V'gar ze'evim keves, v'nemerim gedir bats." We read at the end of Pesach, about the wolf and the lamb dwelling together. We are far from that time. We are far from that time. And I have a picture of the door, which you can't go back behind, the door of the Simanto family. That book belonged to the children of the Simanto family. Shachar and Arbel, twin girls, 6 years of age, and Omer, 4 years old. They, together with their parents, Tamar Kedem Simantov and Yonatan Johnny Simantov, were murdered in their safe room in kibbutz near Oz. When the terrorists were unable to get through the door with automatic weapons, they set the house on fire. And so we just read in the Kinot right now with Alalai Li, Alalai Li. I started writing a Kinot the day after Yom Kippur. It had one sentence in it. I didn't get past one sentence because that was Sukkot, and then with everything else that happened, other people clearly wrote a whole Kinot. The Kinot had one sentence after Yom Kippur. I wrote, "In dachafu et harav liodi b'kikar b'Tel Aviv alalai li." Liodi, whose wife and 2 daughters were murdered a year ago, Pesach, Chol Moed, went to daven in the square on to daven there. Sorry, I couldn't have written this. I must have written this. I made a mistake just now. It couldn't have been after Yom Kippur because this happened. It was Chol Moed Sukkos. He went because of all the tension on Yom Kippur. He went and he was davening there. There was a little minyan. They were saying Hallel, and a man who was angry came over and pushed him. If that could happen, that a Jew is pushing another Jew who's davening, a Jew like that, Alalai Li. And that's why I say it now after we read the Kinot, because when we go into page 240, instead of pointing fingers at somebody else, let's ask ourselves, where are we with our Avat Yisrael, for fellow Jews with whom maybe we very strenuously disagree. But we know that those disagreements, that internal dissension is absolutely ruinous. It was then, in the days of Churban Bayit Sheni, and Lo Aleinu, it could be in our day as well, Shem Yirachem. And therefore we announce, L'cha Shem Hatzdaka v'lana boshet hapanim. L'cha Shem Hatzdaka, that He gives Medinat Yisrael v'lana boshet hapanim, that not yet did Klal Yisrael figure out how to live together, even with the disagreements. He wrote something we should be zochim to figure that out very, very soon. Page 240. L'cha Adonai Hatzdaka, v'od terer yifleit me'az ועד עתה, ונבושת הפנים בבחינה אשר נצרפנו אותנו איתי אהבת, לך אדוני הצדקה, וגויים carefully לקחת במסות, ונבושת הפנים בדופש שנצרבנו, נעשה מסות. אדוני הצדקה, הלכו אלוהים, נגדות לעם, ונבושת הפנים ויאמרו על העם, ים סוף גוי ולאהב. Chazdaka b'zeh v'atamei davin Elohim v'navos dapanim v'ven arnai b'zeh kumalei asay lo nukim Chazdaka b'tam shihit am tavan v'yichid b'dvaz v'navos dapanim Elovena tzol shem b'dvaz Chazdaka b'chul kuman v'ev amudanan v'navos dapanim v'lech m'klakel avotenu v'lehem ragna Chazdaka v'mibar l'chasan v'davar v'navos dapanim v'liat sot mavar and zeh v'tizah v'var Fanayatzdaka v'zichon v'malachot Kinot v'dabarim v'achar v'cheir Chadonai Tzedaka v'foah asher po'alta Arba asar moshim v'navos dapanim b'tzal micha kibbor v'nach v'poshim Chadonai Tzedaka v'kimad shilo v'no v'gibor v'beit olamim v'navos dapanim v'resh nimtzavon v'shachar v'aman v'chlamim Chadonai Tzedaka b'shnei churbanot shachar v'vizeinu v'anachnu kayomim v'navos dapanim v'shuveinu elecha v'chol eish teshuv eleinu v'rachmim L'chadonai Tzedaka b'tshameot shana shehayita sin'a chusha milihishama v'navos dapanim ketava ish chamudot hatei Elohai oznecha v'shma. Page 244. We ask Hashem to listen to the terrible things that our enemies say about us, the terrible things, and the ways in which they create libelous claims against us. The greatest scholar of the 20th century about Gerush Sfarad, the Inquisition, is none other than Ben Zion Netanyahu, Zichrono Livracha, the father of the current Prime Minister of Israel. The book, which you can find at the Skokie Public Library, is, I think, impossible to read. It looks like a telephone book, for those who remember what that is. It's hardcover. It's massive, a massive tome. It was published in 1995. It was his life's work. And he dedicated it in memory of his son, Yonatan, who fell while leading the rescue force in Entebbe, July 4, 1976. And he describes how it was that they came to expel all of the Jews. And he points out that the plan was to prepare a monstrous trial against Jews for conspiring with conversos, people who converted to Christianity, to paralyze the Inquisition and kill all Christians by a magical conjuration. The terrible incantation was supposedly to be pronounced by Jews over a consecrated host and the heart of a Christian child, whom Jews and the conversos would crucify for that purpose. A number of Jews, among them leading figures, together with an equal number of conversos, would be caught and be forced through torture to admit to the crime. The confessions would be publicized, and that would inflame the populace, and then attacks on the Jews would break out in many places, and that would be followed by the king's decision to expel the Jews from the country. And thus was born the case of what became known in Spanish history as the Holy Child of LaGuardia. It's hard to believe that this crude charge which actually was based on a mythical tale that was told about devils called Espina's Sordid Tales, would actually serve as the grounds for an inquisition that would last 16 months, that would involve 2 tribunals. And this was actually the charge the Inquisition tried to prove through so-called confessions extracted from Jews and conversos by means of the most appalling tortures. And so it was that on November 14th, 1491, 2 weeks before the capitulation of Granada, there was a war going on between various Spanish provinces. The Inquisition was made public. In Avila, its sentence, they condemned 5 Jews and 6 conversos to the stake for desecrating the host and crucifying a Christian child. And the claim was that this Christian child's heart was ripped out for the purpose of a conjuration aimed at neutralizing the Inquisition to send all Christians into raving madness to their deaths. And the punishments by the secular authorities soon followed. They burned effigies of 3 of the condemned Jews who had died before judgment was pronounced, and they tore the flesh of 2 others, an old man and his son, with hot pincers before burning them alive. The conversos who professed repentance and asked for readmission to the church were strangled, and then their corpses were burned. In Avila, where the sentence was issued, 1 Jew was stoned to death by the populace, and preparations to attack the Jewish community were halted only by the timely intervention of the kings. At the same time, the Inquisition made public its sentence in all the cities of Castile and Aragon, with the obvious intent of arousing the people and moving the sovereigns to proceed against the Jews in the manner the Inquisition had urged. It was not long before the kings responded to the Inquisition. On March 31, 1492, 3 months after they had entered Granada, they ordered the banishment of the Jews from their kingdoms. That banishment of hundreds of thousands of Jews, led by their leader, Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, happened on August 2nd, 1492, Tisha B'Av. We read Hatei Elohai Oznecha, and we think about the horrible calumnies that are perpetrated in this world against the truth, where Jews are automatically knee-jerk vilified, where the word genocide, a word invented by Raphael Lemkin, whose entire family was killed in the Shoah, in order to prevent it from happening to Jews again, has now been inverted and used against us. When we hear these words, when our ears ring at the terrible, horrible things that they say about us, we ask Hashem, Hatei Elohai Oznecha, don't you hear the horrible inversions? Ribono Shel Olam, save us from these terrible claims. We know the violence to which they lead. Page 244, Hatei Elohai Oznecha. Oznecha, Otsu Eitza, Chashvu, Messima Ba Yuchalu, Ushma. Sicha Noah Lei, V'Avdavalecha, Lod Nista Kalu. Atei Elohai Oznichal Niyat Zevshil Chuveis Mikdash Moral Shma Mecharefecha Mad Mimeko Mad Mimei Toda V'Kol Simra Atei Elohai Oznichal Leit Sim Latzon Chamdu Elohim Shma Kol Cherpatim Shecherfucha V'Apelim Aleihem Atei Elohai Oznichal V'Yaharu V'Otziyu Ruvim V'Choved Mechazrim Shma Chotinufam kehelu al mizbachacha chazirim matei Elohayos nechal lechilu matil fbeit kodesh kodeshim b'shma tzeirim zark and mulach milo kidosh matei Elohayos nechal leazim Olim alim geneis b'veit Elotei Elohayos nechal verani b'ovsiod u'shmagi dufe b'cherfu cherufe mishtachet tzedak yisachot Hatei Elohayos nechal voza u'mal eger matochili ve'enu nivnei u'shma b'cher maspidim v'korim u'mechakim hatei yiboneh Hatei Elohayos nechal ve'olomim Uzav shukach u'mutash blood shomei u'shmaim katenu v'kanei kinatenu ve'yapanecha mikdashcha shomei Page 248, Isaiah Levanon, recalling the sages known as the 10 martyrs. We remember them today. We remember them on Yom Kippurim. We remember Hamedi Tamida Chachamim, serve in Sahel, how they give lie to people who should know better, who make fatuous claims that it's impossible to be a Shomer Torah mitzvahs and serve in Sahel. Those are erroneous claims. They're not right. They're not correct. Einenu Ra'u, our eyes have seen. Great Talmidei Chachamim, Shivot is there, and Shivot Gvohot. And yes, some from other yeshivot and the Olam HaCharedi who have served, who are serving valiantly in Sahel. There's this particular Kinot for today, which we're not going to get to say, but I put it even in the packet for today. You can take it home. It's also what I emailed to you that was written about 10:7 about the Kamenson brothers. By Elchanan Kamenson, Hashem Yikom Damu. His father's a Rosh Yeshiva at Otniel. And his father wrote a sefer called Ameh of the Haaretz. It's about the Agadot HaChurban. He published this book a few years ago. And in the introduction to that book, he says, I'm just translating loosely, it wasn't translated English yet, but he says there's a Rosh Yeshiva who lost friends and students who are like my children, who were murdered on Kiddush Hashem while they were Be'et Milui Tafkidam, the Binyan Bayit Shlishi. They were trying to build a third Beit HaMikdash, meaning they learned the Yeshiva in Otniel. He lost students in battle, and he lost students also in this savage attack that happened in 2004 on a Friday night in the yeshiva. He said, I learned that a Churban Prati is also a Churban. And there's no difference. When a person sees that they've experienced the Churban, and they see the Churban that has happened also, he writes this to the people who live in Gush Katif. I learned that this happened even from the state of Israel. Reshit Smichat Gilatenu. I learned that Keshem She'afshar L'Taken Kal Gam Afshar L'Kalkel, borrowing from the language of Rabbi Nachman and using it inverted. And painfully, it's much easier to ruin. If so, the fear that we may sin and that our sins will bring a catastrophe upon us is a real fear. And therefore, we have to be careful again and again to look in the books of Chazal who want to save us from sin and want to save us from punishment. And we have to go back and to look at the mistakes that our sages have pointed to, the errors throughout the generations, and to learn from them how to prevent it. Benny Kalman's son, his two sons, and his nephew went to the Otef on October 7th from Otniel. His son Elchanan, after the two brothers and the nephew saved over 100 people in Kibbutz Be'eri, sadly Elchanan was killed. Sadly, he was killed. And at the Shiva, so many people from Be'eri came to pay their respects and to tell the family that they owe their lives to Elchanan Meir Kalmanson, Ben Yocheved, Ubinyamin Yosef Kalmanson, Hashem Yikom Damo, Nafal Bikrav, Chav Gimel B'Tishrei, Hey Tavshin Pei Daled, Ben Arba'im Ushtayim Ben Oflo. That's what it says on his inscription on Har Herzl. We read together page 248 about great cedars of Lebanon. Zilvano Nadirei Torah, Litrisin Mishnav Gemara, Berchoach Amaleh Torah, El Nishbab Nishtag, Amkidosei Erugei Malchut Asara, אלעיל אני בוכייה ואיני נגרע. וזאת ויזק במבורך חמדת ישראל כליך קודש נזר בתורה. תורי לי קדושי מת ומיתה חמורה. ידעו גורל מריסון אחר ברורה כי נפול גורל רבן שמעון פשט צווארו וחג נגזר גזירה. שמעון חזר אגמון להורגו ונפש נצורו ונזרו אהרון שב בקשו לבכות נגרע. טוב בראשו תנוע רגבותיו. No, people, Pogmura, no, Amar, Midgabe, Batura, Ignasala, Midamazun, Hamura, Hapsi, Shobatar, Haskira, Kia, Miro, Amru, and Afshay, Shekhi, Navora, Shaposhet, Kia, the Mekom Tfili, Mitzvah Bora, Sak, Sakov, Nizdazola, Beres, Itpora, Meachara, Vivi, and Rabbi Akiva, Kedari, Midochanan Zubazo, Bisvara. Sacred sorrow Masrei Sobarzel he Stabra Astanishmato Bechad Vad Kol Amra Ashrech Rikiva Gufach Tahor Bechuminatora Ben Bava Rabbi Yehuda Chara Vivi Shibim Levazara Nerag Ben Shibim Shana Videi Arura Shibatani Dayo Nakiv Chasid Mual Delamara Ben Traduna Chara Makil Kilo Betzion Shara Shevadores Sefer Torah Imo Vikifu Chavles Mora Etaur itzitu bahem charchu v'sefer Torah sinfugim shel tzemer hinichu alibo shelo yamut meira chasid Rabbi Yesheva v'sofer haragu amamura zeraku v'shlichu laklavim v'lukbar b'kura yatzavat kol alav shelo hiniach lo mitorat moshe shamra v'yahachara Rabbi chutz b'yom evra of haporeach nisra v'avel piv yivamdura tzadik Rabbi Eliel Azar ben Shemua Bacharona Nerag b'Madkira Erev Shabbat Yahasmat Kiddush Vaygadesh Vayikra Chev Shalfu Allah V'linichu B'chaim L'Gomra Yas Nishmato Bevaro Elohim Yotzer B'tzar Tzura Kahin V'chayin Yosifu B'nei Avla L'Adod B'Gara V'Skila Sreifa Hereg V'Chenek Yuchalish Ara Notera Mimani Yochlu Arayot Sef Tzura Chazei Hatnufa V'Shok HaTruma Tarafu Aryeh V'Akfira Yetiv Adonai V'lo Yosif Od Liasra Ameitz Birkayim Koshelot Chelek Yaakov Moshiach Beitzara Tzedekim Loch Melech Yomar Shalmuim Evlech Loro Nisa V'Nelech. Page 260. We recite together the Kinot Vet Navi. It's about two individuals. It's about two children, descendants of Rishmal Kohen Gadol. I'm just mindful of the time. We're going to say Kinot as agreed till 10:45. We'll sit together till then we'll complete the davening. And then anyone who wants to continue to say Kinot, of course, you're welcome to the rest of the day. And all the links that were sent out, you can avail yourself of that. Page 260, Vet Navi Chatati Yishmima, the story of two children. Chatat Yishmima V'Yimatialech Yazrima V'Yimzeni V'Yimrima If a leven is goed gadal gadol, ik ook heeft zeer v'nivda badol, albeinu vad b'shmal kohen gadol, zichram yekor bilvo v'yasima v'yahima, yamima, nisbu v'naflu isnei adonim, v'im shechenim zelumad zechonim, sapru zelazeh inyonim, zamim mesivat tzionim. Shaviti shiv chalvushad shanim kalafona b'sivu klaster panim b'toar b'kitziyah b'yamim v'yahim yamim v'yehu siper b'chiflayim heinanim mishvi Yerushalayim shaviti aver yefeinayim v'shemesh b'tog foetz orayim bo v'zavgei Chalka binatayim b'flatot kemo kochli shamayim shemzot titzalno eznayim b'zeichizot emadaya frima Hima miyamim yamima v'yiskimo azot shneim yachad erev ziv gum b'cheder echad v'adoni u'mibachutz libam ke'echad v'im bochi yehi b'mach ha'nefesh b'pachad ha'boker b'chyatam lo hidmima v'hima miyamim yamima זה יספוד וחיל וקיר לב ימסד ין ארון איך לסבכו ינסי גם היא תיאכל בתיגר שעושה, ביוכבת איך לאפת, ינוסה, אוי כיסות גזר אומר ועושה, לזאת יבכו אש ותסיל וחימה מימים ימים, האורבו כזה את זה, והיקי הכירו, הוי אחי והוי אחות הגבירו, נדבקו ונתדברו, יחד ונתחברו, עד יעשה נשמתם נשימה והימה, ימימה, אז זאת יפנני מייה, בישיה, גזירת זאת תמיד, אני בוכיה, ולבב יקר יקוד וחביה, על בן ובד, מספד רב ארימה, אריד בשיחי והימה וכל נהי ארימה. Of course, you can't read the words that we just read, Ze'amar Mishivyat Zionim. So you can't read those words. I took captives from the Zionim, from the Zionists, and not think of Ariel and Kfir Bibas, and Mother Shiri, her father Yarden. Think of Omer Shem Tov and Agam Berger. Of course, we think particularly about Hirsch Goldberg, Poland. It's very hard to understand. Very hard to wrap your head around this whole thing. But those are our Kinot. We turn to Kinot Chaf Hey, Miyitain, Rosh Hashanah. It was written about the First Crusade. Somewhere in the order, it was a terrible tragedy, and three communities were destroyed. That's why we have Avarachamim. The number of people who were killed in those three communities, which we have all these, the Tfilah of Avarachamim, is approximately 1,400. The world population was smaller, the Jewish population was smaller, but this was such a great shock that it had such an impact on the Jewish people that that's what they did. They made a special tefillah pretty much for every single Shabbos as a result of what had happened there. Miyitain Rosh Hashanah, we read together, page 270. Miyitain Rosh Hashanah, Beinim Kornos Lai, V'kei L'tay V'lei, Halalei, the Bible Lai, Yesi, V'shishai, Temanu Avoy, Chem Chover Cherav Erev, Beit Yisrael, V'lam Adonai Kinaf L'chorev, V'titmayini, V'el Chaliz, Devochim, V'kei Mimorei, Le'vovan, V'ochem Avatulot, Ayav, Ariela, Dim Harak, Im Sifrem, Nichrachim, V'latevach, Nimshachim, אז מפנינים מספרים ונובחים, כמותי, תחוצות, נידש ומשלחים, סורו תמי, קורו למו, מלקורי בבית ישראל, ועלם אדוני, כי נפלו בחורב. ותרא עיני דמעה ואלי לבנות ולי חי, חגורסה, כקרא להספידה, מפז יקרה וזהב חמודה, פנימה חבודה, כל כלי חם דריתי הקרוע שחול גמוד התורה ומקרא משנה והגדה אנו וקוראים זאת להגידה אי תורה תמיד והלומדה הלא מקום אין יושב חורב בבית ישראל ולעם אדוני כי נפל בחורב ואף אפה יזלו מים דמה להגירה והכונן מר עלי הרוגי אשפירו ושני בשמונה ויום הרגו והוקרא מרגו הנחלפו להעביר הנהגו בחורי חמד ושישי הדרה נעשו יחד נפשם השלימו במורל ייחוד שם מיוחד ייחוד השם בגבורה יוריכו חוסי דברו למהרה וכהני ולומי נגבו כולם עשרה ומר יגוני ועצבי אל הלכבירה כאילו הקודש הריגתם היום בזוכרה כלבר מייזה בחונה ובחורה גאוני ארץ ונקיי תורה פעמיים קידשו שם מיוחד במורה 23 בחודש זיו בטהרה בחודש השלישי בקריאת הלל לשורה השלימו נפשם באבק כשורה והימה עליהם מבכי הלל לחזרה כלולי חטא הראשם לעטרה ועל הדירי קהל מגן צעדורה ונסורים כלו מהריאות להתגברו וישלימו נפשם וייחוד שם הנורה ועליהם זעקה שבר שערה על שני מקדשי יסודם כיום ורערה על חרבות מעט מקדשי ומדרשי התורה בחודש השלישי והשלישי נוסף ודאבון מירה ונפח ליגו בצער ביום התדה ציברת להתעשרו ביום נתינתה כמו כן אז חזרה תלה למורה למקום מדורה and take him and I take him hados of Hokra, Londeb, Sonea, Bison, Kemovil, Simuna, Lovchem, he's paid Malikosra, he's a cool Arigatami Dabel, he tapra, like straight for Beta, Inu, Alam Abira, in the Hosif Moed, Shavatavera, in the Hagdim Zulati Lachara, Taha Kain, Hayom, Liviati, Oreira, Espedovi Lulav, Kevin, Efes, Moral, and Khati Kavdami Boker, Ered, Albani Israel, Alam Adonai, Kinaflu Bechar. Alayla Nibuchia, we know him anymore. Vector Mekonod, Velachamod, Elia, Velia, Kulam Homod, Esmachokim Lapo, Vila Damod, Kuzaragel Chev, Mechadari Memod, Halalai, Halalai Chere, Mudolima Rumim Barumod, Blotam Kesu, Halachayar, as Babemod, Yone, Higimi Seva, Lamim Valamod, Mitatim Bamo, Monaib Marbim Kilimod, Elohim Samru, Zur Hasayu Boadmod, Yabob Yosia, Yachzia, Nesamod, Chazinyam, Yamo, Honosei Alumod, Evita Power, Gorkamod, Bamor, Elai Malikera. Elohim, who your Reb, Abed Israel, Amadunai, Ginafu Bechorev, Eini, Yordamayim, Ginabach, Leva, Misorer, Ugav, Vilakol Bochim, Elaf, Vilakarer, Mianudli, Mimaxi Pitorer, Chem Biotso, Sarmid Gorer, Chalani, Amamai, Atzarat Sorer, Shibarat Mutai Zorer, Umefarer, Sila Kolbira, Yatabur, Zorer, Ritio Mazor, in Levarer, Makati Anusha, the Ein Matil, Misorer, Alkena Marti, Sumani Amorer, Bibchidi Mati Alachi, let's read Albeit Israel, Al Amadunai Kinaflu, Becharev. We won't have time today to read the Kina written by my Chaver, Rabbi Moshe Hauer, Shalita. It's called Kina al Ma'ora Od Zmanenu. You'll see it in the sheets that are appended to the list of the Kinot. It's also in the email that I'd sent out with that link. You see, I think it's on page 6 and 7. There are other Kinot, by the way, in the PDF packet also. We just can't get to all of them today. And the reason why I wanted to line the two of them up next to each other is Mi'etain Rosh Mayim. He also wrote Mi'etain Rosh Mayim. And the point is that it's also about marauders on their way to Yerushalayim. The Crusades were about going to Yerushalayim. The Al-Aqsa flood was about a mission to go to Yerushalayim, on the road to Yerushalayim, and it was about slaughter of people, and the number actually matches up. So there are a lot of parallels over here. Let's go next, just for want of time, we'll go to Kina Lamed Aleph, page 304, H2 Kad, page 304. Self-explanatory. Page 304, explaining B'tzeitim Mitzrayim, B'tzeitim Yerushalayim. H2 Kad B'kir B'Baloti, Alibi, B'tzeitim Mitzrayim. Kini Ma'ira, Lamana, Skira, B'tzeitim Yerushalayim. As Rima says, Really, Naseh. Gedenyam Yav, Nanihi, Yav, B'tzeitim Yerushalayim. Beitit Kona, B'shachana, Anna, B'tzeitim Mitzrayim. Chamad El Shachna, Laika, Anna, B'tzeitim Yerushalayim. B'liyam Ramu, B'chomar Kamu. B'tzeitim Mitzrayim. Zidunim Satafu, Baruch Satafu, B'tzeitim Yerushalayim. The Gan Shamayim, Mitzuri Yazuvu Mayim, B'tzeitim Mitzrayim, Lanamrim, Mayim, Amarim, B'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Ashkem Borei, Svivodar, Borei, B'tzeitim Mitzrayim, Korei, Elevel, Anarod Bavel, B'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Marei Kavod, Adonai, Ezachel, Fanai, B'tzeitim Mitzrayim, Chelu Tusha, Uletevach, Netusha, B'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Zevach, Umincha, B'tzeitim Mitzrayim, Sigulat, Lekucha, Kitzon, Lativcha, B'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Chagim, Shabbatot, Moftim, Velotot, B'tzeitim Mitzrayim, Tanit, Ve'evil, Rodova, Evel, B'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Tov, Ohali, Lavad, Galim, B'tzeitim Mitzrayim, V'hola Yishmaeli, Machanot, Arei, B'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Evel, Shmita, Ve'eretz Shoketa, B'tzeitim Mitzrayim, Achur, Latzmitu, V'charut, V'chatur, B'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Kapur, V'arol, V'avnei Zikaron, B'tzeitim Mitzrayim, V'avnei Akala, Chlei Habala, B'tzeitim Yerushalayim. V'im v'acharonim, zivim zikein, b'tzeitim mitzrayim, no gesim, umonim, umochrim, v'konim, b'tzeitim Yerushalayim. Osir eino, Aaron yanchen, b'tzeitim mitzrayim, uchadnetza, v'yanus kesa, b'tzeitim Yerushalayim. Naroch, nusama, v'adonai shama, b'tzeitim mitzrayim, rachak mimenu, v'hinei eino, b'tzeitim Yerushalayim, sitre faroch, v'sitre marech, b'tzeitim mitzrayim, imani teched, v'laiso cheched, b'tzeitim Yerushalayim. Ola Uzvachim, Ishay Nichochim, B'tzeitim Mitzrayim, B'cherem Dukarim, B'nitzion Yikarim, B'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Parei, Migbaod, the Chavod Nikbaod, B'tzeitim Mitzrayim, Surikot, Turuod, the Kolod, Uzvaod, B'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Tzitz Zahav, Hamshel, V'haraha, B'tzeitim Mitzrayim, Shachanezer v'afas ha'ezer v'tzeitim Yerushalayim kedusha unvua u'chvadanaim nira v'tzeitim Mitzrayim nigala u'mora v'tuma v'ruach hatuma v'tzeitim Yerushalayim rina v'yishu v'chatzot tzor hatrua v'tzeitim Mitzrayim zakatullah v'nakat chala v'tzeitim Yerushalayim shulchan menorah v'chalil u'ktorah v'tzeitim Mitzrayim liva toifa u'fesel matziva v'tzeitim Yerushalayim Torah u'teuda u'chli ha'chemda v'tzeitim Mitzrayim Sason v'simcha v'nasegon v'anacha v'shuvi l'Yerushalayim. Turn to page 328. Rabbi Yehuda Levi, very famous Tzion Oloti Shalish Lomi Sirayich. We're thinking about our Asirei Tzion now. I'm going to read to you from an email that was sent by Rachel Goldberg to about 20 people in March of 2009. I'm not portraying a confidence. It wasn't sent to me. It was sent to my colleague, Rabbi Daniel Yalkut, who was her rabbi, and she was when they lived in Richmond, Virginia, from where they made Aliyah. This has been written up, and it's already in the media. There's stories you can find online about this email. I'm going to read you an excerpt. It's the last reading, really, for today, and then we'll finish up to the best of our ability. She writes the following, March of 2009. She's writing to friends, family. In the middle of a long email about their Aliyah. She talks about Hirsch and school, different things. And then she writes, I feel the need to share with you that today I did something that was very emotional for me. I went to the Prime Minister's house in Jerusalem, where there is a tent set up in front. Gilad Shalit's parents and brother are living there to demonstrate their tireless effort to get Gilad returned home. As you know, she writes, Gilad was kidnapped in 2006. He was 18, and he has been held alive. There has been correspondence to and from him in Gaza for what will be at the end of this week, 1,000 days. I didn't really mean to go there. I was on a walk, and then I thought I'd go over to see what was happening. There was a wall set up with thousands of little notes people have put up for Gilad's family. I saw the tent and went over to poke my head in. There were lots of people outside the tent and several TV cameras. But when I looked inside, I saw Gilad's parents sitting in the corner reading articles about their son and the failed negotiations regarding him. I was drawn inside and I went and sat down next to Noam, Gilad's dad. I said, my name is Rachel and I'm a new immigrant. And then I started to cry and I seriously could not stop. I was looking into the eyes of my worst nightmare, and although I tried so hard, I could not compose myself. He was so kind to me. He started talking to me in English, and he tried to make me feel better. I finally was able to pull myself together and have a good conversation with him. He introduced me to his wife, Aviva, who looks dead. She almost looks deranged with grief. Then he called in his son, Yoel, who also tried to make me feel comfortable, since he could see I was crying. I don't know what else to say about this. As I left, I noticed one note on the wall in English. It was a quote from Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Jerusalem. It was said by one of the righteous Gentiles who hid Jews during the Holocaust. It said, quote, at least I know when I die and stand before God, he won't say to me what he said to Cain in the Bible. Where were you when your brother's blood cried out from the ground? End quote. I have felt sick for the rest of the day. When I came home and told John about this experience, I started sobbing all over again, and he got emotional as well. If you want to know the name of Mama Rachel in our generation, it's Rachel Goldberg. Page 328, as Kina and as Tefillah, Tzion haloti shali l'shlam asirayich. Tzion haloti shali l'shlam asirayich. Dorshi shlomeich v'm yeter adarayich. Miyam u'mizrach u'mitzafon v'teiman shlom rachok v'karov. See mikol avarayich. Shlom asir tikva. Notein tamav kital charmon. V'nichsaf l'ridatam harayich. Livkot enuteich anitanim. Ve'et echelom shivat shuteich anichinor l'shirayich. Libi lefeit el v'lifnei el me'od yemeh. V'lamachanayim v'chol nigei torayich. Shama shchina shchunavach. Tzreich patach l'mol sharei sachak sharayich. Kodem nai lefarah hayam orayich. Ve'in sar b'shemesh v'chavim orayich. Yevchal nafshi listaped b'mkom asher ruach Elohim shefuch al b'chirayich. Ed ben melucha ve'ad kisech v'od el ve'ich yash v'od m'alichis v'gibirayich. Mit in m'shoteid b'mkomot asher niglu Elohim l'chozayich v'tzirayich. Mia Salich Nafaim, Archik Nador, Ani, Lafitre, Lavovi, Benik Betareich, Apple Api, Ole Artsei, Verts Avanaich, Limod, Vachonein, Aftafareich, Keep on the Ale, Kivrod, Avotai, Vestamei, Malay. Chevron, Mivchar, Kivarai, Haravorim, Behor Asasham, Sne Orim, Gedolim, Oraich, Moraich, Hain is a mod of your say, Omimar, Deror, Avkad, Afarech, Anofet Suv, Naraich, Hinam Lanapsi, Halo, Harum Yachev, Alech Harvot, Shemama, Shahayad of Uraich, Yimkom Aroneich, Sanignazim, Kom Kuruvaich, Shachnu, Chadre, Chadaraich, Agos, Beashlich, Beer, Nezer, Ekotman. Chilel be'eretz Bavel Nisirayich Eich Yerovli Yaakov Setod Be'irach Hazeh Ki Sachavu HaKlavim Et Kifirayich Oeich Me'or Yom Yimatog Leinai Be'od Erev Fior Vim Pigrei Shivitlarayich Kosi Gonim La'ad Harpi Me'ad Ki Chavar Maluch Salai V'nafshi Mimromayich V'ezker Allah Eshtech Amoreich V'ezker Holy Vav and Smarech Sion Klulat Yofi, Avav Chain or really or Vav Nixuru, Navsot, Haviraich, Hemasmeich, Musabatech, Go Avi Masmotech. Vons Varaich, Borsavis, Rafim Negech, Mustachvimis, Mukomo Ale, no Chachsaraich, Edre Hamonei, Haser Galov, and it Pazru, Mihar, Giva, Rosachu, Deraich. Zikim Sulaich, Mitam Tzimlalot, Lechos, Visan, Sinait, Moraich, Sinah, Rufatros, Yarchucha, Vigodlon, Vim Hevlov, Yadamu, Lutumaich, Uraich, Vami Yadam, Meshichaich, Velmi, Naviaich, Vami, Leviaich, Vesiraich, Son of Yachlov, Khalil, Komam, Lechod, Lilim, Chosnech, Leula, Lidor, Vador, Naziraich, Evil Mosa, Vilhaich, Vasher Enos, Yivcha, Vikrav, Yiskon, Bachat, Ziraich, Hashem, Mechak, Viagia, Veire alot oreich yibaku alav shecharayich lirod b'tovat b'chirayich la'alot b'simchatech b'shuveich elei kadmut neurayich. Please take in your hand the Kinal Shoah. Is there an extra copy? Someone only have the first side. It's supposed to be a double-sided sheet. So if someone has a double-sided sheet, you share? I'm so next to it. I don't know. That's supposed to be the side sheet. I have the one side. If you have one side, you need two sides of the sheet. We're gonna do both sides, two sides. We don't do the chorus, but our minhag is to sing it. By the by, in case it wasn't apparent already, I have more to say about it. We're out of time. A direct line links the Shoah and its catastrophe, and the fact that someone wrote a Kinot, it's the last of the Kinot before Elit Zion. And I always said, when are they going to write a Kinot on terror, on all the people who died in terror attacks in Eretz Israel? Sadly, I got my wish this year. So we'll read the Kinot Shoah, we'll sing it together. We don't usually stand for this Kinot. It's only for Elit Zion at the end that we stand, but we recite together. And again, it tells the story, and then we'll do the one on Chorvot Barzel, and then we'll conclude with Elit Zion. And if it sounds like it's very long to sing this tune, so just we'll think about the magnitude of these tragedies, each one. Eli, Eli, nafshi bechi, bezaki, bat Yisrael, mispeitzi v'hityapchi, ach lo ha'esh beYisrael, al tevach am asher uchan, Yisurei shchol ashdod damim, zakein v'tav lo rucha, al akedah korban tamim, olalim mulei chalav, Rut Hashim lefitzurim, ve'al damam asher zav, rosh chutzot le'ein orim, al hakihilot hashomemot, ve'al kurban mikdeshei yikud erei lahav shalavot, arefel beYisrael, alei dorot asher igda'u, demei avot v'dmei banim, V'gei Auschwitz tamu gavahu, alei mokdot akiv shanim, alei chluim chagu reisak, הנמקים ברבבותיהם, וטרבלין כי ומדנק, ומלקט עצמותיהם, עלי קרונות צפופי אדם, אשר רוקדו גופרית וסיד, צחי צמא בכלות נפשם, צעקו מים ואי מושיט, Alevilim Amechulalim, Bidei Natzim Menatzei El, Trufim Kruim Megoalim, Ben Ashvatot Ve'ein Goel, Al Tzadikim Al Nevei Olam, Nedivei Amogei Torah, V'Taira Al Nechnak Olam, Nafla Kavita HaMenorah, Alei Kiddush Hashem Ve'a'ah, Al Nikmad HaTeorim, V'Tatzumot Masu Nafsham, Lachamu Naflu HaGiborim, Al Shever Am Bisakina, Uleyagon Atu Yeshua, Al HaNetzach Tapil Sina, V'Lo Tifros HaNegoha, Re'ei Elohim Ori Tzafad, Nafal Libi Sonai Kamin, Hakshiva Shavi Chisha Miflad, Hatzila Nafshi Me'anshe Damim, Eli Eli Nafshi Bechi, V'Zaki Bat Yisrael, Mispesi V'Hit Yavchi, Achla Ha'esh Be'Yisrael. Please join me for the Kinot, written by Maran Harav Yosef Tzvi Rimon, also to the same nigun, and Davka to draw the link between the two. And Davka, you notice that last Kinot are already with a nigun that hopefully soon becomes a nigun of Nechama. Please join me. It's a handed out sheet. Simchat Torah, Shmini Atzeret, Nepach Mecholeinu, Tuga Koderet, B'yom Zeni Fritzu, Agderot, Yishuvei Hotev, Ufakim Usderot, Eicha Artzeinu, Haita Lemirmas, Vatim Alei Haaretz Chamas, Meritzu Adazah, Mekor Haresha, Mishoresh Hamas, Yatza, Tzefa, Eicha Bimkom, Sheva Hakafot, Nasu al Nafsham, Meimat Chatifot, Oyev Achzar, Matzit Serefot, Rotzeach Mashpil, Belila Harpot, Eicha Bimkom, Tfilat Hageshem, Yaradodi, Larugot Habosen, Shoshanim Nitbachim, Chilul Hashem, Lamiratzchim, Al Titen Yad Vashem, Eicha Bishnat Shivim Vashesh, Timrot Hashan, Dam Vaish, Yehudi B'machbor, Necherad V'lochesh, Tachad Oneg, Shabbat Kodesh, Eichad Bnei Tzion, Hayikarim, Aflu Bidei Anasim Arurim, Mirutei Lechi, Netunim Lamakim, Achim Chatufim, Bidei Chamasim, Vayom Bo, Shimcha Hitchalel, Luchamim Ne'evku, Et Shimcha Legadel, Habeit Ure'ei, Mikamcha Yisrael, Chozkeinu Ve'amtzeinu, Uval Tzion Goel, Kebarzel Achamu, Amitzot Amitzim Ahuvim, Adinei Nefesh, Miyatzar Meginim, Vigvurotam, Ra'inu Tshuat Olamim, Nizkefa Komatenu, Dor Geulim, Bayom Bo Nitme'an Achlatenu, Utra Lefirsum, Gvurat Amenu, Nafsham Bechapam, Mosrim Giboreinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Nekom Nikmat Achenu, Al Shimcha Gadol, Nikra Shemenu, Zocher Mazkir, Berit Avotenu, Mitzafon, Mitarom, Umdim Chalotenu, Uvritcha, Umedet, Lanu Be'artzenu, Aritzei Farah, Paras, Yazmu Alilot, Matachim Shalchu, Nosei Tefilot, Sifunim Zashvu, Veinehem Milachalot, et Nisecha Ra'u, Norat Ilot, Kanfei Ruach, Kanfei Nesharim, Ra'ora Inu, B'ra'ayot Chayalim, Horim Viladim, et Yakirehem Mekabrim, Chazkein Ve'amseim, Adat Abirim, Galei Sin'a, Shotfim Olamecha, Shotzefim Sorim, Al Makdishei Shemecha, Rodfim at Shiluchecha, Nos Edgalecha, Be'ava Yina, Aleinu Dilugecha, Hashev Chatufim, Kradror Lashvim, Neta Kurim, Be'avat Nisachim, Shakem Petzurim, Romain Bitkaim, Naheladatcha, Bechesed V'rachamim, Modim Anachnu Lach, Al Medinatenu, Al Geulatenu, V'Apidut Nafshenu, Miuchadim Tolichenu, Komamiut Be'artzenu, Hachesh David, Mashiach Tzidkenu. Include now page 390, reading Elitzion together. Please rise for the recitation of Elitzion, and then conclude the tefillah after that. Elitzion ve'areha, Moisha v'tzireha, v'chi v'tulach hagurat sak, al ba'al neureha, le'armon asher nutas, ve'ashmatzon adareha, ve'al bi'ad mechorfeil, v'toch mikdash chadareha, ale galut meshareteil, man imeshir zemareha, ve'al damam asher shupach, כמו מימי יאוריה, עלי הגיון מחוליה, אשר דמם בעריה, ועל ועד אשר שמן, וביטול סנהדריה, עלי זבחי תמידיה, ופדיוני בכוריה, ועל חילול כלי חל, ומזבח כתוריה, לטפי מלאכיה, בני דוד יביריה, ועל יופיים אשר חשב, ויצרוך את עריה, עלי כבוד אשר גלה, ואת חורבן דביריה, ועל לוחץ אשר לחץ, ושם סכין חגוריה, עלי מחץ ורוב מכות, אשר הוכו נזיריה, ועל ניפוץ עלי סלע חוליה, נאה ונעריה, עלי שמחת אויביה, שחקו על שבריה, ועל עינוי בני חורין, נתיביה טהוריה, עלי פשע אשר יפתח, סלול דרך אשוריה, ועל צבאות קהליה, שזופיה שחוריה, עלי קולות מחרפיה, ועת רבו פגריה, ועל רגשת לגדפיה, בתוך משכן חצריה, עלי שמך אשר חולק, לפי קמי מציריה, ועל תחן יצבחו לך, כשוב ושמע אמריה, אלי ציון בעריה. לא אישה בציריה, וכי בתולה חגורת שק, על בעל נעוריה. Continue now on page 398, the conclusion of Shacharit. Ashrei Beitafo Yalu Chaselo, Ashrei Ha'am Shekachalo, Ashrei Ha'am Shadunai Elohav, Tila David, Aruchim Choelohai Hamelech, Ruchazim Halam Edochal Mavercheka, Ashim Halam Edochal Mavercheka, Meor Viduot, Im Cheket Udo Shabach Masach Vorta Vigid Vadag Vodak Nidrin Hosera. Bezuz nor techi umeiru go hasaperna zecharav to chayabi zikat chayiranei no chanon rachon adunai erech hapai mugdal chazed vanel go rachon zevenu mazav chaside ukolvel dia livnei hadam gvurot horodam chutzol chutcham chut koolamim umemshal chvul dor vador smech anachon v'yoshev chuvim. אני יכול להכניס סבי ותמתנו חום ביתו פותח את הדרך מסביר אחר הצוד צדיק גם בכל רחב של הצפון בכל רחב החוש מבית שמי תילה ידבר פיו רק מסשם פעל לציון גואל ולשבי פשע ביעקב נאום אדוני קדוש 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 אדוני צבאות כל הארץ כבודו. ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו.
Some located a hand grow in the home, I'm starting helping. Start holding them on with the hook. Tisha, you start, so goes my boss. Hey, my phone. Emmet, okay, no FS, similar to the title. She was the key out of my will, but I'll can do a hard night and live heavy in our by leaving earlier than the Shavak or Sean of Nech at night.
So today is at 12:55 p.m. Mincha 1:35 p.m. Please note that our program with the Chayalim will be at 5 p.m. Change in time to 5 p.m. And the film from Yeshivat Har Etzion Yikbet Midras Nashim Migdal Oz at 6:15 p.m. And there's a mincha later on at 7:25 p.m. The fast ends at 8:35 p.m. May this be the last Tisha B'Av we have to observe as a sad time. In Yerasim, we should hear Besorot Tovot, Yeshuot, and Echamot.
Please return the books and